I want to start with a quick story. A few weeks ago, my family was at the dinner table, and we were making our way through the daily worship guide that you heard Darren talk about earlier that you can find in your worship folder. And for those who are using this, I know that people are using it in a variety of ways, and that's awesome. For us, the way we've been doing it, we've started by singing the song. For us, it's helpful. Rebecca can participate on Sundays when she knows the songs. And so we start by singing the song together, and then we read the passage together, and then we try to ask some sort of question. Something that helps Rebecca to enter into a conversation about the passage in some way. And as you may be aware, in whatever conversations you've had with a 4-year-old about the Bible, there are certain kinds of passages that are harder than others for a 4-year-old to talk about. And so we finished reading together a few weeks ago the first chapter of Paul's most of us can't read Paul's letter. I struggle with Paul's letters. So to say we're talking about the first chapter in 1 Corinthians, I'm looking at how do I start this conversation. So I just kind of set it up by saying, okay, so Rebecca, Paul is telling us that we are being built into a building. And then I asked, so who is doing the building? And that quickly responded, the builder. Yeah, right? Okay, well, who is the builder? Silence. God is the builder, I say. He is building us into a building. No, he's not. Builders are the ones who build, she says. So I move on, thinking this is all going to make sense by the end. She'll be with me by the time I've, explained this well to a 4-year-old. Well, okay, so then the builder is making us into a building, I say. Rebecca, wait, are we in the building? No, I told her. We're the bricks that God is using to make the building. See, he puts us together. Wait, so we are in the bricks then? No. We are the bricks. And then if you've never seen my daughter make this face, she kind of squints at you and looks like sideways. We're on the bricks? 4-year-olds are far too literal to understand metaphors. Because what a metaphor does is it joins two unrelated concepts and it brings them together in order to suggest that there's a connection in some way, that there's an analogy to be made. Our passage this morning is driven by a commonly misused metaphor. So if you would turn with me to Ephesians chapter 6. And this will be our last week in Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And we'll start in verse 10. Paul says, finally, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. Stand, therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and as shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. In all circumstances, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one. And take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, praying at all times in the Spirit, with all prayer and supplication. To that end, keep alert with all perseverance, making supplication for all the saints, and also for me, that words may be given to me in opening my mouth boldly to proclaim the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains, that I may declare it boldly as I ought to speak. This is the word of the Lord. The church's inability to read this passage and other passages like it as metaphors have made Christians, those who bear the name of the Prince of Peace, some of the most warmongering people in all of the world throughout the last 2,000 years. So let me be honest about my own position here right up front. The language of warfare that we find in this passage, of putting on armor, of wrestling, of withstanding assault, of standing firm, all of this language together makes up a single expansive metaphor that's designed to prepare the church and to motivate the church to live powerful and faithful. This metaphor has real meaning. And in fact, I think that this closing passage is actually, in this closing passage in Ephesians, is central to understanding the work of the church, our task here and now. But I think it's far more helpful and profound if we can recognize the metaphorical nature of this language and to recognize the limits of the metaphor. And so the question becomes, where do you start? How do you start to read through this and make sense of it? And I think the best place is probably to determine, well, okay, what are the two things being compared? What's being said, and then what's being imported, brought in order to sort of add or make sense of this core idea? Well, if you look at the first word of our passage, it opens by saying, finally. Finally is generally the last thing on your list, right? As you're making your way through. And finally. And week after week, what we've been doing together, what we've been hearing together, what we've been reading together is this extensive list by Paul of all of the things that the church is to be and the things the church is to do. And so we've been making our way through this list, and here Paul says, finally, this is the last word on the subject, at least to the Ephesians and at this moment. In some ways, it seems that these words are then connected back to Paul's urging. All of you are to live, to walk in a way that's worthy of the calling to which you have been called. Or it could be that this is the final example after his instructions that you should no longer live in the way that the Gentiles do or that you used to. It doesn't matter where you connect it back to. It's clear from the context that these are Paul's last instructions, final instructions on how the church is to live, what the church is to do. This is the literal reality for the church receiving this instruction. They're in a place and they're needing to live and to be and to do what it is they've been called to do. And so these words come from Paul. They're being prepared and they're being motivated to live faithfully. But we discover that the church isn't alone in the world, right? The church isn't by itself figuring this thing out on its own, just us and God, but there seems to be some sort of obstacle to life in the Messiah. There's something that wants to block us or prevent us or keep us from a life of faithfulness. And without yet maybe having to determine, well, who exactly or what exactly are these rulers and authorities? What are these cosmic powers that we read about? These cosmic powers over the present darkness. It's enough to say that there is an opponent to faith. So the first side of the comparison, remember a metaphor brings two things together, two concepts. And the first side of this comparison, the present reality, we know, we experience. It's the life of faith. It's the need for us right now to go on living faithfully, but in the midst of the challenges that make living faithfully difficult. And so, Paul, like so many masters of rhetoric before and after him, he compares this life to our most extreme and bloody form of contest. War. A fight to the death. To illustrate the kind of challenge that we face. This is a matter of life and death. Which means that your preparation, your putting on of this metaphorical armor is necessary, because behind the rulers and authorities is the devil, the evil one who schemes against us. The evil one is on the offensive. And this is in no way an isolated idea in the Bible, right? One of the central questions that the book of Revelation is asking, and we spent 9 months together last year working our way through that book. But one of the central questions is, how is the church to respond and to live in the face of constant opposition and challenge posed by evil in the world? What is the church to do in light of evil is the question. And Paul tries to answer that question here. And he does so by neatly packaging this warfare metaphor for us. The church is to put on the whole armor of God by equipping itself in God's resources. The gear, as you read through the list, is all standard. It's standard for ancient war. You have a belt and a breastplate, shoes and a shield, helmet and a sword. But this isn't any ordinary set of armor. Not when righteousness and salvation are the things to be worn. But this is battle gear that is necessary to help us live faithfully. But this is where we immediately come up to the limits of a metaphor, right? There's a comparison being made, but these are not the same thing. Our experience is not exactly like war, because how does one tie truth around the waist? Like, how do you do that? How am I to wear salvation on my head as though it were a helmet? So, right? This is not something that can actually be done in a literal sort of way. We should spend a lot. We could spend a lot, and I mean a lot of time trying to break down each one of these individual pieces of the armor to determine exactly how we are to try to put it on and exactly what it means in each and every case. And so sort of dissecting the metaphor to its smallest bits. We could do that. Or we could do what far too many have done in the last 2,000 years, which is use this warfare language to justify acts of real violence, acts of real warfare against real flesh and blood. Or we could do what others have done, which is we could use this warfare language to try to scare people into the faith, to talk about scary demonic activity in the world. Turn to Jesus, or they'll get you. Or we use the warfare language to talk about some sort of like spiritual crusade. The world needs to be converted, and we have the weapons and the army to do so. Onward, Christian soldiers. The problem with these readings is that only one verse into this passage, we should already have a sense that there is a far better way to hear this and to read it. And so look at the first verse. Be strong in the Lord Be strong in the power of his might. 3 different words are here, all referring in some way to strength. And I don't know if it's necessarily important how the 3 words are different. I think the point here is that they're all piled up, pointing us toward the Lord and his strength, his power, his might. And as I think about the story of the scriptures as a whole, I can think of very few themes more prevalent in the First Testament than an ongoing call for Israel to trust in the strength of their God. And this isn't a rally cry or fear-mongering in the First Testament. It's a call to relationship. It's a call to trust their God as his people. Recall with me stories that may be familiar, but if not, I hope to give enough context that you can hear how this story goes. Israel has been set free from slavery in Egypt, and they're hustling through the desert with Moses when they come to the sea. And they're blocked. And as they approach the sea, they immediately realize that the Egyptian army is following them, is in pursuit of them, and is rapidly approaching. And this army has chariots and horses and real weapons. And the Israelites have no weapons and lots of children. And they begin to panic. And Moses cries out, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." And the story ends. And these words, it ends with these words. Israel saw that day the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, and the people sang, "The Lord is my strength." And then later, Moses is telling a new generation the story of when Israel's ancestors had been afraid to go into the promised land, and he retells his own words. "Do not be in dread or afraid of the people there. The Lord your God goes before you, and he himself will fight for you, just as he did in Egypt before your eyes." And again, Moses is giving instructions on real warfare for Israel. And he says, when you go out to war against your enemies, and you see horses and chariots and an army larger than your own, don't be afraid of them. For the Lord your God is with you, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Do not fear or panic or be in dread of your enemies, for the Lord your God is he who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to give you the victory. If at this point in the story the idea of the Lord fighting for Israel is a bit vague, like, okay, God, but what does that look like? It all becomes clear when they get into the land and stand against their first army or enemy. And the Israelites are given these nonsensical directions about marching in circles and blowing trumpets, and that is what will bring victory. Okay, they do it. And all of a sudden they watch as walls fall down. The Lord has fought for them. But just as quickly as they see what it looks like for the Lord to fight for them, they then learn quickly that there are consequences of fighting without the Lord, as they then turn to their next battle and they're defeated and they're embarrassed as a result of running on ahead. With an ear toward the Lord's strength, you begin to see and hear as you read through the First Testament that the rise and fall of Israel is directly connected to Israel's ability to trust that the Lord is able to protect them and fight for them. One of the serious criticisms that then comes from the prophets toward the leaders of Israel is that they trust in everything other than God. They trust in horses and chariots and weapons of war and large armies and treaties with their powerful neighbors rather than trusting the Lord, standing and watching him Fight for them as he promised that he would do. Transition with me back to our passage here in Ephesians. Be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. In the opening verses of this whole letter from Paul, we find Paul, the pastor, praying for his church. And in the Greek, we discover that he's praying these same three words that we find in this verse. He prays that the church might know the immeasurable greatness of God's power toward those who believe, according to the working of his strong might. Power, strength, and might. The kind of power, strength, and might that working together, Paul says in this prayer, was a part of bringing Jesus back from the dead, resurrecting Jesus. Jesus was raised by the power, strength, and might of God, but there's more. This power, strength, and might is also what then seated Jesus at the Father's right hand in the heavenly places. And we've heard that phrase. But here we learn what it means. Jesus is seated far above all rule and authority and power and dominion. It's the same language from our passage here. When we choose to be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might, we are not trusting to choose. We are not trusting a God who can defeat the rulers, authorities, and powers. We trust in the one who already has put the rulers, authorities, and powers in their place. In another one of Paul's letters, his letter to the Colossians, Paul says it this way: through the cross, God disarmed the rulers and authorities. In other words, whatever weapons they may have had are now gone. But more, Paul continues by saying, God then put the rulers and authorities to open public shame by triumphing over them in Jesus. Paul isn't just saying these powers have been defeated. He says that they have been publicly humiliated. They thought that by crucifying the Messiah, they could defeat God. But instead, their only real weapon, which is death, has now been transformed by the power, strength, and might of God. And now, Jesus leads these defeated rulers and authorities and powers handcuffed and naked through town. That's the picture that Paul is painting for us. They're being led through town the way that a victorious emperor would parade back to his capital city with his defeated enemies behind him, showing them to be who they truly are. All things are now under the Lord's feet, Paul proclaims. This is why we misuse the warfare metaphor. Every time we use it as though the church has some battle that we have to go out and fight for the Lord. This is why we misuse the metaphor every time we elevate the forces of evil to the level as though they were God's equal and opposite force. But instead, we rightly use the metaphor when we hear it as a call to persevere, a call to stand firm, a call to pray, a call to continue in what God has already started and accomplished. But it would seem from this passage that the church is able to forget such things. The church can turn back to its own resources and its own strength. The church can, if it is not active and attentive, be tricked by the schemes of the devil. And if tricked, the church is tricked because it has returned to darkness. The church has forgotten how weak and how pitiful the enemy is. It is tricked because it has refused to trust the Lord and has instead returned to its trust in worthless and weak substitutes, those things that cannot save. Strength, power, and might. Like the Israelites before us, the church has seen the strength and the power and the might of God at work. Paul prays in the beginning of the letter that we would understand these things. But then also, like the Israelites before us, the church that has seen God act definitively to show up in our midst is tempted to forget. The church is always tempted to go back to its own resources. And so, Paul prays for the church again. This time in the middle of the book of Ephesians, and this time not that we would understand, but that our understanding would transform into an ongoing trust. He prays that the very power, strength, and might of God would become manifest in our lives. So Paul prays twice for us, but he doesn't stop there, because now he is instructing the people he's been praying for to do what he's been praying for. He has been actively engaged with God and pleading on the church's behalf that the church would know and be filled with God's strength and power and might, and then knowing full well that God does not just do things to us, like zap us with instant strength and immediate power. He prays. Or he tells us to be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. He prays that we would trust, and then he tells us to trust. In the First Testament, to watch the Lord fight for you, it was not a passive scene. It wasn't like people were just kind of lounging around in lounge chairs, enjoying some shuffleboard, and all of a sudden somebody's like, hey, look over there, God is doing something for us. Right? Where all of a sudden people were surprised. Hey, look, you're right. It's pretty cool. Maybe we should get up from these chairs and go check it out. No, to stand firm and to watch meant that the people knew. They knew that they were in a precarious position. They knew that there was an unmatched enemy coming at them, or they knew that they had an impossible task in front of them. Standing firm then meant a refusal to run. It meant refusing to manufacture weapons. It meant refusing to build up an army. And it meant refusing to go and look for neighbors to help you. Watching meant actually standing firm with the promise that God was with you. There was an active participation in standing, watching, and waiting. Paul makes it clear that not only do we have God's power, strength, and might available to us, but if you take a look at the rest of the armor, which is of course the armor of God, we have truth and righteousness, the gospel of peace and faith, salvation and the word of God. Not one of these resources can be built in a factory. Not one of these can be mass produced to sell for a profit. Not one of these can we buy or trade for. These are gifts from God alone. And God alone is the one who gives them. Paul prayerfully announces at the very beginning of this letter, the first chapter, that God has already blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places. And now Paul tells us to put them on. We have seen and are called to trust in the power, strength, and might of God. But the same goes for salvation and righteousness and the Word of God and the others. Trust in the one who gives them. Put them on so that you may be able to stand, Paul says, so that having done all, you may stand firm. The question comes, against what? Against anything. Against everything that Paul has already announced to be part of our former lives when we lived lives apart from the Messiah. Anything and everything, anything that is not true. The resources that God gives us helps us to stand firm against anything that would darken our minds. These resources, these gifts from God help us to stand firm against anything that alienates us from God. Anything that would harden our hearts. Things like bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander and all malice. That was from earlier in the letter. Or the passions of our flesh, our greed, our lust. Anything that would create disunity in the church, anything that stunts our growth, anything that replaces God in our hearts and our lives, idols manufactured with our hands, anything that must be kept hidden because it is so shameful, anything. This is what the resources and the gifts from God help us to stand firm against. By the time we get to Paul's final words here in Ephesians 6, we don't have to wonder who these rulers and authorities and powers and spiritual forces of evil are. It is clear. They are the unseen energy or forces behind all of this. Everything and anything that separates us from God, all that seeks to destroy us, all that opposes God. And yet, being disarmed, they have only one place to turn, one recourse, and that is to scheme. Scheme against us, to get us to drop our guard, to distract us, to make us comfortable, to make us complacent, to make us forget. I think we misuse this metaphor. When we look at all of the bad stuff that happens to us or happens in the world, and we blame it, and we look to blame. It must be the devil, it must be demonic activity. I don't think that that's what this passage is trying to do for us. I wonder if this passage is calling us to open our eyes. Not so that we can assign blame for the bad stuff that happens, but instead so that we might see where we are being seduced to abandon the strength and the power and the might of our God in order to settle for impotent saviors. Paul's final word is that, like him, the church ought to pray. They are to pray at all times for themselves, for one another, for him, so that the church might persevere, might stand firm, might remain in the Messiah. And so I want to close our time this morning by taking some time to pray together.